Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research, a podcast by Agora Project. Join us as we delve into the behind-the-scenes world of groundbreaking research and the dynamic healthcare industry, interviewing top paper authors, engaging experts on industry-related topics, and exploring medical subjects that affect our daily lives. And now, your host, Dr. E.F. Rain.
Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, Efrain Riveros, Dr. E.F. Rain. Today, we are going to discuss a very important topic related to metabolism, adipose tissue, and menopause, and all the interactions between these aspects. In order to have a rich discussion, we have an expert here. We have the honor of having Dr. Vieira Potter. She's an associate professor of nutrition and exercise physiology at the University of Missouri. Welcome, Dr. Vieira Potter.
Well, thank you so much. It really is an honor to be here.
Thank you. So we are going to base our discussion on a paper that Dr. Vieira Potter published with her team titled Adipocyte Metabolism and Health After Menopause, The Role of Exercise. It was published in the journal Nutrients in 2023. So before we go into the details of the paper, I'm going to start by asking Dr. Vieira Potter, what was your motivation to start doing research in this important topic?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So I've always been interested in obesity and metabolic health and how exercise and diet are just such critical players in protecting metabolic health, and the major diseases that are causing morbidity and mortality in this country and others are diseases like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, and diet and exercise are the way to prevent those things and to preserve metabolic health. I've also been really interested in studying sex differences, and there's this really interesting sex difference in metabolic disease such that women have protection pre-menopause, such that, age-matched, obesity-matched males and females seem to be protected against metabolic diseases. But this changes following menopause with the loss of estrogen, namely, leading to an increase in risk in cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And I was just really interested in that shift because it's like women have this incredible protection, and it's really clear that it's related to estrogen and sex hormones. And so what are the mechanisms that really are driving that protection? And so that how can we capitalize on those mechanisms to improve metabolic health even broadly across the population, especially among postmenopausal women who struggle with developing metabolic dysfunction following the menopause, but also in other populations who struggle with weight gain and metabolic dysfunction. So I guess that really was my sort of motivation. And I have background in nutrition, so I'm really interested in nutrition and how that affects metabolism. But I'm equally interested in exercise. And I did my PhD with an exercise immunologist, where we were really studying how exercise affects metabolism at the molecular level. Mechanistically, what is exercise doing, in my case, to the fat cell? That's really what my dissertation was focused on, is really looking at how does exercise affect fat cells. And then learning about how in the menopause transition, women become less active. So I thought just, my gosh, this is so incredible. Exercise is this powerful protective agent, and women are protected, and then they lose estrogen, and they actually have this reduction in physical activity. And so that's contributing to this metabolic dysfunction. So I was really just became interested in studying the mechanisms by which exercise was protective, by which estrogen was protective, and so just to, see what was going on there.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, women in the premenopausal years, they are protected. They have the hormonal levels sufficient to maintain their metabolism, but things start to change as they approach menopause. And the combination of knowledge that you have regarding exercise and diet and all the interactions between the two in the context of menopause, it's what we are going to center our discussion on today. So let's start by giving people a little bit of a background. What, in general terms, are the main physiological changes during menopause that can be related to changes in body composition, weight, and metabolic pathways?
Yeah, so pretty commonly, as women approach and go through the menopause, they will notice weight gain. In particular, women tend to experience a redistribution in body fat. So, generally speaking, prior to the menopause, women tend to store fat in the subcutaneous depots, hips and thighs, especially. So, that's called the gynoid fat distribution pattern. Whereas males tend to store fat a little bit differently. They store excess adipose tissue in the central region of the body, which we call visceral fat because it's surrounding the visceral organs. And that body composition profile, more typical to males, associates with metabolic dysfunction. So as women go through menopause, they notice this belly pouch developing, right? That many women haven't really had throughout their life, and they sort of notice this throughout, during the menopause transition. So that's one thing that does happen, and just overall weight gain, as well as a different metabolic profile in terms of insulin sensitivity and triglyceride levels. It's very common for women who are insulin sensitive their whole life to go through the menopause, and their doctor might say, your blood glucose levels are a little bit higher than they used to be. You might be developing some prediabetes. And that's, it's associated with the visceral fat gain, but metabolic shifts do contribute also to these different blood profiles, dyslipidemia, and higher levels of blood glucose.
Yeah, that's excellent. So let's focus a little bit on the body composition, and let's focus specifically on the premenopausal age. So when women are premenopausal, what is the role of the hormonal profile on maintaining the body composition?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So I think what distinguishes a premenopausal woman from age-matched male is insulin sensitivity. If I had to pin one thing, I would say insulin sensitivity. And part of that is women have very insulin-sensitive adipose tissue. Insulin is required to store energy in adipose tissue. It's a very efficient energy storage form. And sort of from an evolutionary perspective, this is really beneficial for women who are going to bear children. We need to store fat very efficiently. And that insulin sensitivity allows for that adipose tissue, as well as skeletal muscle, to act as a really nice sink for blood glucose, right? So generally speaking, women are more insulin sensitive. We're very good at clearing blood sugar and storing fat. And what also is associated with the premenopausal profile of having higher levels of estrogen is that fat tends to be stored very efficiently in subcutaneous depots, less so in the central visceral depot, as I mentioned earlier. And that too associates with, again, very efficient fat storage in a healthy fat storage, right? Because it's a very insulin sensitive adipose tissue in the subcutaneous depot especially. And so that's sort of the hormonal and metabolic profile of the premenopausal woman is sufficient levels of estrogen. Physiologically, normal levels of estrogen for premenopausal women will associate with a healthier body composition and higher insulin sensitivity.
So, and this has to do with, as you mentioned, with the levels of estrogen. So at the molecular level, what does estrogen do to maintain that nice insulin sensitivity?
Oh, that is a fantastic question. It's one that I think is not fully answered, right? There are many mechanisms, and in my lab, we're actually we're probing some of those mechanisms, right? We're trying to figure out how is it that estrogen improves insulin sensitivity. So estrogen really has its effects, as many hormones do, through their receptors, right? Through its receptors. There are two main receptors that estrogen functions through, and those are estrogen receptors alpha and beta. They're both nuclear transcription factors. They're steroid transcription factors that bind estrogen, and they go to the nucleus of the cell and they turn on genes, right? So they regulate gene expression. They do lots of other things too, but that's kind of the classic definition of a steroid transcription factor, and that's how estrogen has its effects. Now, those two receptors, alpha and beta, mediate different responses. It looks like, based on the animal literature and some of the human literature as well, that we talk a little bit about in the paper, it looks like estrogen receptor alpha really is the receptor that that mediates an improvement in insulin sensitivity, right? So as I mentioned, premenopausal women, very insulin sensitive. They have high levels of estrogen receptor alpha on their adipocytes, the cells of adipose tissue, as well as other cells. ER alpha also mediates the feminizing effects of estrogen, right? And so that's sort of the mechanism. We don't know how signaling through ER alpha improves insulin sensitivity. We do know that one of the mechanisms might be an increase in GLUT4 receptors. So there have been some studies that have shown that activating estrogen receptor increases the expression of GLUT4. GLUT4 is that really important glucose transporter on the surface of adipocytes that allows for glucose to enter, allows for glucose clearance in response to insulin. GLUT4 is an insulin-sensitive glucose transporter, unlike the other insulin glucose transporters. And GLUT4 is expressed on skeletal muscle cells and on fat cells. And it looks like estrogen is conducive to increased levels of GLUT4. So that might be part of the mechanism. There are other mechanisms as well. We think that, or there's data to show that estrogen also improves fat metabolism, improves fatty acid oxidation. Indirectly, that will improve insulin sensitivity as well. So I think there are transcriptional mechanisms at the regulation, at the level of gene regulation, and then there are also indirect mechanisms as well. And there are probably other mechanisms that we don't fully appreciate yet. But there have been studies, lots of cell culture studies showing that estrogen does improve insulin sensitivity at the level of the cell, meaning it improves the sensitivity of the cell to insulin for glucose uptake. But we think it's mediated through the estrogen receptors.
Perfect. So now more at the macro level. You mentioned in your paper that as you enter menopause, you start experiencing an imbalance between energy intake and expenditure. So what is the contribution of those two factors in the equation? Is it more increase in energy intake, or is it more less energy expenditure? Is it efficiency? What are your thoughts about it?
It's a great question. And again, I don't think we have a clear answer. My opinion, based on the read of the literature and my own work, is that it's a bit of both. But my opinion, and again, based on the literature and my work, is that it's really more on the side of energy expenditure. And in fact, most women sort of anecdotally, that when you talk to them, they will say, I've not changed my diet. If anything, I'm eating less because I'm paying more attention because I'm gaining weight, yet I'm still gaining weight. What is going on? Right? So a variety of things are going on. Again, I think it's at the energy expenditure level. In fact, there have been one group of studies that I know of are called the Monet studies. These were studies that were conducted several years ago now, but they were really tightly controlled studies where they followed women across the menopause transition, and they assessed them annually for food intake. They did, they did dietary records. They looked at their energy expenditure. They tracked, how active they were and how much exercise they were doing. And overall, what they found was that it was a reduction in energy expenditure, particularly from physical activity, that was contributing mostly to the weight gain. Okay, so those studies indicate that it's expenditure. Studies in rodents, including studies that I've done in my laboratory, have shown that quite drastically, when you remove the ovaries from a rodent, whether that be a rat or a mouse, she, within 2 weeks, becomes significantly less active. In fact, there's about a 20% reduction in cage activity. So we think it is physiological. We think it's mediated by the brain, but we do think there's a reduction in physical activity, whether that be motivated or spontaneous. We think that's occurring. And we also think energy expenditure at the cellular level might be affected by estrogen as well.
Yeah, and when we talk about the cellular level, it caught my attention what you mentioned in your paper about the triad of adipose tissue function. So as menopause kicks in, there are multiple things happening at the same time. So in terms of inflammation at the adipose tissue level, also systemically, the insulin resistance that you mentioned earlier, and also mitochondrial dysfunction. So what is the role of the mitochondria in all this?
Oh, that's another great question. It's really kind of at the center of my lab is studying right now. And, I love this idea of the triad of adipocyte health. It's a phrase I just came up with several years ago now, when, based on the idea of immunometabolism, right? And so I started studying adipose tissue inflammation and how that caused insulin resistance. And then I did work as a postdoc showing that estrogen loss also contributed to inflammation in adipose tissue. And it looked like these things were even independent of the amount of adipose tissue that was there. So independent of total adiposity, either increasing inflammation or decreasing insulin sensitivity, both were negative, right? And really inflammation appeared to be a major trigger of systemic metabolic dysfunction. So where mitochondrial function comes in is inflammation also adversely affects mitochondria. And people don't really think about the adipocyte having mitochondria, right? We think about skeletal muscle mitochondria, and cardiomyocytes, are chock full of mitochondria, but we don't really think about the adipose tissue as having mitochondria. And certainly we don't think about the mitochondria in adipose tissue serving really any purpose, right? Because the adipose tissue really is built for storage. But studies recently have been showing that, ramping up mitochondrial activity, even a little bit in the white adipocyte, really is metabolically beneficial. And I think that's because these things are all very related: inflammation, mitochondrial function, and insulin sensitivity. There are so many intricate relationships there that if you improve one of those things, you generally improve all of them, right? And I think that the mitochondrial function piece is important. It associates with insulin sensitivity. Increasing the efficiency of fat oxidation is very metabolically beneficial because fatty acids can be inflammatory, and mitochondrial activity does produce some ROS, reactive oxygen species, which causes inflammation. But what the cell does when it ramps up mitochondrial function in a healthy way is that the ROS that are produced trigger these protective mechanisms. And I think these protective mechanisms are doing really more than even buffering the ROS. They do buffer the excess ROS to protect the cell against inflammation, but it appears that they may be even doing something more than that in sort of having a metabolic benefit. Studies have looked at this idea of adipocyte browning, whereby the white adipose tissue becomes more like brown adipose tissue, which is very different from white adipose tissue. Brown adipose tissue does have lots of mitochondria, right? It's chock full of mitochondria. It doesn't really store fat, but rather burns fat, and it produces heat. That's why it's brown, and because it's so mitochondrial, has such a high mitochondrial density and in blood supply. But it's a very active tissue and produces heat, burns a lot of energy, and it's actually a glucose sink as well. But when studies started to show that you could take the white fat cell and make it more like the brown fat cell, that sort of changed the field in a lot of ways, because it got us really thinking more about adipose tissue, not so much let's get rid of all of the adipose tissue that we can, but rather what things can we do to increase the health of the adipose tissue. And I think increasing the mitochondrial activity of adipose tissue is a great way to do that. I think that's one of the things that exercise does specifically to the fat cell to improve the health of the fat cell.
That's right. And as you transition from white adipose tissue to brown adipose tissue, uncoupling the oxidative phosphorylation and generating more heat and obviously burning calories, at the same time, there is a reduction in inflammation. And that's my next question. What's the mechanism for the inflammation to be triggered? What does exactly happen for it to, because that unchains a cascade of adverse events?
Ooh, that's a good question. So your question is how does estrogen act as an anti-inflammatory agent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Again,
why is that happening?
it's another important question that we don't really have a good mechanism behind yet. We do know that removing estrogen increases inflammation, and when you add back estrogen, that decreases inflammation. Mechanistically, it isn't clear exactly what's going on, except that, again, I go back to it from the level of the adipocyte. The mitochondrial function and insulin sensitivity are so closely tied to inflammation that it might be, impairing insulin sensitivity, impairing mitochondrial function because of loss of estrogen. Because of those two things, we have more clear mechanisms by which estrogen would increase insulin sensitivity, and upregulate mitochondrial activity or improve mitochondrial function. We know those things. The mechanisms are more clear than the mechanism by which exercise decreases inflammation. But we do know that estrogen upregulates many antioxidant molecules. So again, genes that are regulated by estrogen, things like GPX3, which is a very powerful antioxidant compound, is upregulated with estrogen. So that might be part of the mechanism. Could be activating transcription factors that upregulate many of those antioxidant mechanisms. It could be buffering transcription factors like NF-kappa B, which increase the transcription of lots of inflammatory molecules. So there could be many mechanisms. I am particularly interested in the protein, uncoupling protein 1 that you mentioned, that is highly expressed in brown fat. It's what causes that uncoupling, and it's the same protein that we can upregulate in white fat with exercise or with drugs that can stimulate that process in the white fat cell. We've shown in others that there are strong relationships between that protein and inflammation. It looks like upregulating that protein may have anti-inflammatory effects, probably indirect. And it does look like the uncoupling proteins do associate with buffering reactive oxygen species, and so decreasing inflammation. So that could be part of it as well.
Excellent. Now let's move from the descriptive part of your paper to the prescriptive part. Let's focus on exercise now. So exercise has multiple beneficial effects, not only in menopausal women, but in general, especially in the context of obesity, metabolic syndrome, and diabetes mellitus. But regarding exercise, you mentioned that there is a dose dependence relationship. So the more exercise, the better, I assume?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think exercise is the kind of thing like any is better than none. The more, the better. Too much is difficult to get, right? So it's certainly, that sort of thing. Like if someone is extremely sedentary, going from 0 to 1 is a huge jump, right? Going for a moderate activity walk, even a short walk every day is going to do going to have tremendous benefit. But there have been studies that have really done sort of like tertiles of exercise intensity. And they do show a dose response in terms of the protection that you get from the exercise. In particular, recent studies have shown that the high intensity interval training is particularly beneficial for fat loss, in particular for targeting that visceral depot that we talked about as being so potentially negative metabolically. High intensity exercise appears to really target that depot, and it's a really efficient way to promote fat loss. Although any exercise is beneficial.
Yeah, and that was actually my next question. So my wife in particular has asked me this question, and I'm transferring this to you. What is better as menopause approaches? To focus on high intensity interval training, do just endurance training, a combination of both, resistance training? What is your recommendation?
Yeah, so my recommendation would be yes, right? So all of those things. I think, one of the things we haven't talked about that's really critical for postmenopausal women in particular, and everyone who's aging, we're all aging, and this is happening to all of us, but the loss of lean mass, and for women, loss of bone density are two things that happen after the menopause. And strength training is incredibly important for maintaining lean mass, maintaining bone mass. Strength training, weight-bearing activity, walking, doing some like either some jumping exercises, jumping jacks, things like that are really great for bone. Yeah, lots of exercises can be weight wearing in addition to just lifting weights, but things like walking and jogging and that sort of thing are great for that. Again, the high intensity exercise, that going from low intensity to high intensity using sort of these intervals, has been shown to be highly beneficial particularly for fat light. In terms of cardiovascular benefits and all of that, I think any cardiovascular exercise will do that, but the high intensity exercise I think will specifically target, more efficiently target fat loss. Do women need to do that? I don't think so. But I will also say that women should do the exercise that they're going to do, right? The best exercise is the one that you do. So something that you enjoy, because I think enjoying exercise is also really important. To have this as a chore, I absolutely hate to do this interval training, and I'm going to do it anyway because the doctor told me to do it, I don't think is a good approach. I think you can find things that are going to fit into one's lifestyle. And I think I've spoken to many women who have said that, I wish I discovered exercise earlier in my life. I never knew that I loved it so much, but like being outside in nature and walking has been tremendously beneficial for mental health as well, because that's another major aspect of this. So I think weight bearing, I think any exercise, particularly I would recommend exercise outside in nature, because there have just been lots of studies to show that being outside and walking, there is something really cognitively beneficial for that. And there are cognitive benefits that, we sort of, that's something else that happens in menopause, is we sort of memory changes and that sort of thing. And so exercise is just the best prescription, right, for anyone, but especially for women going through menopause. And as far as type, I think the more variety you have, it's sort of like diet, right? Variety is great, but of course you want to focus on the things that bring you joy and that you can fit into your lifestyle and that are sustainable and that you can do consistently. I think that's a big part of this too.
Yeah, and that's great advice. And definitely there is an element of motivation there. But what about hormone therapy? What's the role of it? Does it improve the efficiency of exercise? How do you make it part of the equation?
Yeah, so hormone therapy is an entire, different topic that is critically important. And I think I'm so glad to see this emergence in the discussion of hormone therapy. I think since the WHI, the Women's Health Initiative, which is a major, big hormone therapy trial that happened in the 90s, that has sort of come to light of late. And there have many podcasts and books written about this, because those trials, I think, changed the social perception and even the perception from the medical community about hormone therapy because of the risks involved. And so the short answer for me, and I'm not an MD and I don't study hormone therapy, but from my read of the literature, and I would recommend, so Peter Attia recently did a podcast on this and others, and there's a book called Estrogen Matters that's also very good. But my suggestion would be that hormone therapy is not always bad. I think it's something for a healthy woman who's just going through menopause and is early in menopause or maybe even in perimenopause, someone who's been, healthy and active their whole life, and that now they're suffering from these symptoms like hot flashes and various things. I think hormone therapy, if that person is not at high risk for hormone sensitive cancers, would be a great candidate for hormone therapy. Studies have shown that hormone therapy is tremendously beneficial metabolically. We don't hear a lot about the relationship between metabolism and estrogen therapy, or even bone and estrogen therapy. Bone fractures are a major predictor of mortality in older women, and in falls produce fractures, and fractures, particularly a hip fracture, can really increase the likelihood of mortality in that. So I think, keeping bone strong is so critical. Hormone therapy is the best way to do that. Hormone therapy combined with exercise is critical. But hormone therapy isn't for all women because there are risks associated with it. And that's kind of where the Women's Health Initiative trials, there's all this press about increased risk for things like breast cancer. Turns out, if you really look at those trials, the risk was really, really minor. And I don't even think it was statistically significant. It may have been approaching statistical significance, but it's a big deal. And the individuals conducting the trial didn't want to continue if there was this increased risk. And so there were other things that happened. So anyway, so all that is to say that women shouldn't be afraid of it. Talk to their doctors about it. Combined with exercise, the literature is mixed on that in terms of whether there is synergism to estrogen therapy and exercise. I don't really want to speak to that because I think the literature is really mixed. It doesn't seem to be a negative, but it's not clear that there's a positive synergistic benefit. In other words, it doesn't look like, based on the limited work that's been done, and more work absolutely needs to be done in this area. It's one of the things that we're thinking about in the lab, which is, how can we increase the effectiveness of exercise in this population? Because as you indicated earlier, I think that you mentioned your wife complains that she's exercising and she's not seeing the benefits that she was used to seeing. So what's going on with exercise, like sensitivity, and how can we improve that? And is estrogen loss associated with kind of a resistance to some of the effects of exercise? It may be buffering some of those effects, but so I think really important research needs to be done to figure out what are the ways in which we can improve the sensitivity to the metabolic benefits of exercise, particularly with fat loss. And that's something, again, that my lab has been interested in.
That's critical, and thank you for sharing that part as well. What about nutrition, which is another pillar here? What would be your recommendation in terms of nutrients that could be specifically beneficial for the menopausal women?
Yeah, so that, again, great question. I think the nutritional kind of prescription for postmenopausal women would be the same healthy diet that we prescribe even kind of more broadly, right? Limit processed foods, limit sugars, stick with whole foods, sufficient protein is critical. Essential fatty acids, fish oil is great, lots of fish. Mediterranean diet has been shown to be extremely beneficial. High fiber diet. We're learning more about how the gut microbiota is changing with menopause. It changes with everything we do and everything we eat. But the postmenopausal time of life has been shown to affect the gut microbiota. And so things like fiber in the diet can improve the gut, and that can improve overall health. So fiber, healthy fats, low sugar, low processed foods. I was doing work early in my career on phytoestrogens from soy, and in animal studies, those seem to be beneficial in a moderate way, right? And so all that is to say, diets rich in plant proteins like soy might be particularly beneficial for women because there are phytoestrogens in soy protein that act like estrogen, that look like estrogen. But this worries some people, right? Because they think of those as being potentially negative, interacting with estrogen receptors in a negative way. In fact, the research has not shown that. There aren't good research studies that have shown negative associations between phytoestrogens from soy that we eat and sort of hormonal imbalances, especially in postmenopausal women. And if anything, it looks that those might be beneficial. For example, I did some preclinical studies in rats where I showed that if rats were just on a soy-based diet where there was really rich in phytoestrogens versus a protein-controlled diet that had no phytoestrogens, the group that was consuming the phytoestrogens had no difference in caloric intake. However, they had these improvements in all these metabolic factors, insulin resistance and visceral fat, and all those things that we talk about were mitigated in those rats that were consuming the phytoestrogens. And we think that has to do with the fact that these phytoestrogens do modulate estrogen receptors, although they bind to estrogen receptors with many-fold lower affinity than, of course, natural estrogens. But when you're lacking estrogen, and those studies were done in over-optimized animals, so when you're lacking estrogen, adding some soy to the diet might be beneficial for various reasons. And there's antioxidants in there and other things as well. So plant-based diet, all that is to say, plant-based diet might be a good approach as well as a diet high in, sort of the Mediterranean diet. As far as diet, so you mentioned diet changes earlier, and back to the energy expenditure versus dietary intake piece, I will say that there have been some recent studies that have looked at dietary patterns over the menopause transition. and shown that women, at least in the studies that have been conducted, consume more sugar following menopause. They don't necessarily change their calories, but they change what they're eating. And my personal opinion on that, based on our work, is that it might have to do with estrogen signaling in the brain and sort of a buffering of the dopamine reward system in the brain. And so it might be that estrogen sort of buffers that reward system, and we need maybe a little bit more of those sugars and things to kind of make up for that dip in dopamine. But anyway, that would be my sort of overall discussion of the diet.
And that's awesome. The level of detail that you present in your paper is super important, and it's very nice to read. And I think as we close our conversation, understanding that definitely menopause is something that is coming for women, and how the changes in the hormone profile, specifically androgens and estrogens, and the mechanisms that you just mentioned all play together. But it's not that women are doomed to suffer their menopause, because as you mentioned, exercise, diet, different strategies, hormone therapy, all of them come together to actually improve the quality of life during this stage of life. And the last question before we wrap up our conversation is, where do you think are the knowledge gaps? What should be researched in the future to try to complete the picture?
Yeah, well, I think some of your really great questions that I didn't have great answers to would be a start. Things like, how can we improve the efficiency of exercise in postmenopause? That's an area I think, again, that my lab is starting to think about. I think it's important. And sort of what is the relationship between the neurocognitive psychological effects of menopause and the metabolic effects of menopause? And I think improving one improves the other. And so I think thinking sort of holistically about what are the things that are most beneficial for women, and really bringing hormone therapy sort of back into the conversation, because I think hormone therapy could be a really important aspect of sort of just health maintenance among healthy women. In some women, not all, but I just think bringing that more into the conversation and more research needs to be done in that space of best modality for hormone therapy combined with lifestyle, and what are the lifestyle practices that really give you the most bang for your buck, right? So that's what my lab is trying to figure out, is how can we increase the efficiency of exercise, but how can we really overall improve quality of life as women go through menopause? And because I think it is a really wonderful time of life, and I think it gets a lot of bad press because of all of these, things that happen that are associated with it. But yeah, I think women should enjoy that phase, and I'm just trying to figure out how we can best do that and help women to live the best years of their life.
Absolutely. And as we come to a close, I want to thank you for this highlighting conversation, and how enlightening it is for all of us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and knowledge. And we are going to follow up on your research, and I'm completely sure that we will meet in the future to basically see the results of your groundbreaking research. Thank you so much, Dr. Vieira Potter, for being with us today and for sharing this time.
Well, you're quite welcome. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you're doing with this podcast. I think it's wonderful.
Thank you so much. And thank you. And for our audience, in the description of the video, you will find the link to the paper that we discussed today. And don't forget to leave us your feedback in the comments section. See you in the next episode of Decoding Healthcare Research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or thoughts about today's topic, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to leave your comments down below. For more information and references related to today's discussion, you can find them in the video description below. We appreciate your support and look forward to having you back for our next episode.